for countless ages, the Kissimee River meandered freely through the green canvas of central Florida. The waters of this ancient river nourished a vast population of fish and wildlife, and provided sustenance to those who chose to live in harmony with her many moods. Those who know the rivers of the world compare her past to the great rivers of the southern hemisphere: the Amazon, the Senegal, the Niger. In truth, the Kissimee was incomparable, answering only to her own rhythms, her own poetry. Then the Kissimee's destiny changed. In a span of less than 10 years, the river was reduced to less than half its former size. Its meandering shoreline replaced by the man-made banks of a canal. Its waters controlled by floodgates and levees. Its fish and wildlife decimated. Now there is a new vision for the Kissimee. With the unprecedented cooperation of federal and state governments, biologists, engineers, and landowners, the Kissimee may one day again take its rightful place among Florida's great rivers. Hello, I'm Bill Shomo. I'm standing on land that was once covered by the Kissimee River. It's pasture now, untouched by river water for almost a quarter century. Soon, very soon, the Kissimee will flow over this land again, and hopefully the complex ecosystem that once thrived here will be restored. This is the story of how a great Florida natural resource was tamed, and the steps that are being taken to reestablish it. It will be the largest, most sophisticated, most expensive project of its kind in history, and the world is watching. It took a special breed of men and women to settle in Central Florida at the beginning of the 20th century. Most newcomers, streaming down from the north toward growing coastal towns and cities, regarded the Central Florida interior with disdain. Others had a different vision. A handful of hardy souls saw farms and ranches.
Well, we used the river right up to the river's edge because there was good pasture land on the west side of it. And we'd drive our cattle and then keep them in there in the wintertime.
The river began near Orlando, in the beautiful waters of Central Florida's upper chain of lakes region. This exaggerated view shows how more than a dozen interconnected shallow lakes flowed into Lake Kissimee, which in turn discharged its waters into a river bearing the same name. The Kissimee flowed south to Lake Okeechobee, becoming a vital element of the vast Kissimmee-Okeechobee Everglades landscape. Summer rains regularly cause the Kissimee to overflow its narrow channels, flooding wide expanses of adjacent land. Due to this unique floodplain habitat, the native population of fish and wildlife in the Kissimee River Basin was abundant and rich with diversity.
The first time I saw it, it was a wide river, a lot of water hyacinths, a lot of wildlife, an abundance of birds, all kind of fish. It was just old Florida. It was probably just the way it had been for thousands of years.
Pristine and free, the Kissimee nourished them all.
When the water levels in the river rose, the river overflowed its bank and thereby inundated the entire 40,000 acres of floodplain wetlands. This was particularly important to the fish and wildlife resources of the basin because it provided them high-quality habitat on the floodplain. Fish species, for example, were able to move on to the floodplain and utilize the vast wetland resources for feeding and for reproducing. Wading bird species were also afforded this great array of floodplain habitats. Now, when the water levels began to recede, or when water levels dropped, the resources that were produced on the floodplain, like the small fish and invertebrates, were brought back into the river channel and thereby provided food for the riverine food web.
Periodically, the Kissimmee exacted a price for its gifts. Farmers and ranchers with land near the floodplain often found their crops and livestock standing in shallow lakes. In 1948, a hurricane, followed by several years of violent storms, flooded more than 250,000 acres in and around the Kissimmee River Valley.
It was amazing. The water was from shore to shore. It was several miles wide, flowing. Automobiles could not even get over the bridge. In fact, the bridge was a wooden bridge, and part of it was washed away.
The floods stirred public sentiment, causing an outcry for flood control. In 1961, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began a mammoth flood control project in the Kissimmee Basin.
In the early 60s, when I went down there and saw it, this giant crane pumping dirt on each side, filling up the marshes, filling up the oxbows. The water was muddy, full of tugboats, full of diesel oil. And then I knew that from right there, it looked like they were building the Panama Canal, the Hoover Dam, and I knew right then that we'd made a mistake, and I knew that the Kissimmee River would never be like it used to be.
Back then, we went through an economic analysis to determine what method was best to be used to do our projects. And in this case, for flood control, Kissimmee was thought to be the best method was actually evacuation of the water from the floodplain as quickly as possible. And that was the basic design that was used in the construction of C-38 followed that, which quickly removed the water from the floodplain and moved it downstream to, at the time, was thought to be areas that could handle it.
The river's serpentine channels were transformed into a deep, wide canal. More than 30,000 acres of floodplain wetlands were drained or covered with sand and ancient shell debris from the excavations. 6 water control structures and locks were constructed along the length of the canal. It took nature an eternity to etch the ancient Kissimmee into the Florida landscape. It took 20th century engineering and machines, 10 years, and $28 million to obliterate it.
I'm standing on the bank of the C-38 canal. This bank was formed by what engineers call spoil. As the canal was excavated, the material, the spoil, was simply tossed up here on the adjacent wetlands. And this is how the Kissimmee looks today, 300 feet wide, 30 feet deep.
The new water control structures function much like dams, retaining water in lake-like impoundments called pools. When the canal was completed, it appeared that engineering had triumphed over nature. The Kissimmee had been tamed. Towns and cities no longer felt the threat of floodwaters. Farms and ranches expanded on land made suddenly available by the drained floodplains. And then other things began to change. A vast mosaic of life, severed from the nurturing embrace of a once pristine river and its wetlands, began to disappear. After numerous studies, researchers confirmed what seasoned river hands already knew. channelization had delivered a devastating blow to wildlife. The loss was staggering. Wintering waterfowl had declined by 92%. Bald eagle territories decreased by 72%. And wading birds, once a wild palette of color throughout the river's shallows and marshes, were replaced by the ubiquitous cattle egret. In 1971, the U.S. Corps of Engineers completed final work on the C-38 canal and turned over management responsibilities to the South Florida Water Management District. Agency scientists confirmed not only had floodplain-dependent wildlife been diminished, but that the quality of the river water had been degraded.
Each of us who measure dissolved oxygen realize very quickly that dissolved oxygen is one of the major limiting factors to the fish community in the channelized Kissimee River C-38 system. The channelized system, again, acts more like a series of reservoirs, or the pools of the system act like more reservoirs or lakes than it does a flowing river. The lack of flow and the increased summer temperatures compound to cause a negative effect on the fish community by depleting dissolved oxygen in the water column.
Public concern over the declining condition of the Kissimee River Basin rose from a small grassroots movement to a roar heard in the highest offices of the state.
We had a beautiful river. The channelization took it away from us, and the general public as a whole wanted it back. I could not have done this thing alone. I had to have public support, and we had it. The general public overwhelmingly supported the restoration.
For the next 12 years, federal and state agencies studied and conducted tests to determine how best to reestablish the river's lost values.
The answer was here. In the 53-mile-long pile of spoil the dredges deposited as they excavated the canal. If the river was damaged by excavation, scientists reasoned, why not, in simplest terms, simply take the spoil and shovel it back in?
The Kissimee River Restoration Plan is based upon over 20 years of scientific study. These studies have shown that the way to restore the integrity of this system is to reestablish the physical form and the hydrology of the river and floodplain. The only way to do this is to fill in a long, continuous reach of the canal.
But would the plan work? And if some of the canal could be backfilled and the abandoned floodplain reflooded, could flood control still be maintained? To simulate the effects of backfilling, 3 small dams, called weirs, were constructed at strategic points along a 12-mile stretch of the canal. The weirs partially diverted the flow through adjacent remnant channels and over a small portion of the river's original floodplain. This created somewhat of a microcosm of the historical river floodplain system. The South Florida Water Management District, the Department of Environmental Protection, and the Florida Game and Freshwater Fish Commission monitored the project from 1984 to 1990.
From an ecological perspective, the key result of the demonstration project was to show the feasibility of restoring biological resources. Floodplain wetlands were reestablished, and wading bird and waterfowl utilization of the demonstration project area was higher than in any portion of the channelized system.
An essential question remained unanswered: flood control. If a significant portion of the canal was backfilled, opponents asked, what would happen under extremely wet or hurricane conditions? Would the catastrophic events of the 1940s and the 1950s return to haunt Central Florida?
In the late 1980s, high discharge tests were carried out to determine how a dechannelized Kissimee would be affected under heavy flows.
There were tests done during the demonstration project that were called high flow discharge tests. Essentially, this simulated a large storm event in the valley and in the chain of lakes. Can we get the water out of the chain of lakes, and how does the river floodplain respond and getting the water out of the river floodplain. The results of that high discharge test gave us clear information that showed that you could maintain flood protection and restore the river floodplain ecosystem.
Though many restoration alternatives were considered, the final endorsement for backfilling came from a 3-year research project carried out by the University of California. Conducted under the supervision of Dr. H.W. Shen, a world-renowned expert in sedimentation and environmental river mechanics, detailed topographical models combined with computer analyses revealed that backfill material would remain in place.
We've done a great deal of research in both the abstract and in the laboratory, building a test model at Berkeley, and also in the test weirs to determine what would happen as we filled in the river channel. Those results, as well as the practical results from the 1,000-foot test fill, have shown us that the river is very capable of healing itself. Our expectations have been fulfilled and then some.
30 years had passed since the giant dredges began their march up the Kissimee. All the pieces were now coming together for an attempt to turn back the clock. In 1992, the Corps of Engineers agreed to participate with the state of Florida in a comprehensive environmental restoration plan for the Kissimee River ecosystem.
Executive decisions have already been made.
The plan was funded by the Water Resources Development Act, enabling the federal government and the state of Florida to equally share the cost of restoration. The total cost is expected to reach $380 million in 1992 dollars. The plan contains 2 major dependent components. At the headwaters of the river, more than 20,000 acres of land surrounding the upper chain of lakes will be purchased to increase water storage capacity by raising lake levels. The existing water control structure that regulates flows from the lakes to the river will be modified to allow a continuous flow and higher discharges. Just as the flow from a hole in the bottom of a bucket varies depending on the amount of water in the bucket, river inflows will be allowed to fluctuate with lake levels. On the central portion of the channelized system, some 22 miles of the canal will be filled. 9 miles of former river channel will be re-excavated, and 2 of the 6 water control structures will be removed. Over a period of 15 years, more than 40 square miles of floodplain ecosystem will be restored.
What's really unique about this project is that it's scientifically based and scientifically driven, the goal of restoring the ecological integrity of the river floodplain ecosystem. To achieve that, though, you have to restore the physical form and the historic hydrology of the system. And those are clearly engineering design techniques. So the two have to meld together to create an achievable restoration project.
Foot section of the canal was refilled with material that had been dredged from the river almost 35 years earlier. The adjacent spoil banks were leveled, enabling the water to return to a portion of its original floodplain.
The primary objective for doing a pilot construction project was to test the construction methodologies and test how the soils will respond as we put them back in the canal.
South Florida Water Management District personnel monitored the water quality downstream of the test plug.
What we determined, our conclusions from our sampling program were that there was really no impacts, at least no long-term impacts associated with test fill construction. We did note that there were some increased turbidities directly north and directly south of the test fill area during construction activities. Turbidity at those sites did increase quite a bit, but we saw no downstream transport of total suspended solids.
Other South Florida Water Management District biologists soon found positive signs in the newly created floodplain.
Within weeks after the spoil material was removed, wetland plants began to emerge from the freshly exposed soils. Now, 80% of this area is covered with a diverse complement of submergent and emergent vegetation.
Evaluation of the test fill will continue to provide critical information for fine-tuning the full-scale restoration, which will begin in 1998. Though the restoration plan has been approved, some individuals and groups still believe the project to be a mistake.
It wasn't ideal when they did it to start with. Now we're going to spend how many times that expense to try to put it back where it was. It didn't suit anybody then. What makes us think it's going to suit them when it goes back? At a tremendous cost.
Well, we wasn't in favor of them doing what they've done to it, and I think that the best thing to do is leave it alone just like it is now, and not try to go back in and fill it up.
Despite this thoughtful and at times vocal opposition to the project, 25 years of research and testing points to the potential of an excellent recovery of the river's environmental values, values that extend far beyond the Kissimee.
Well, if you look at the Kissimee in relationship to the overall system, this is the headwaters. So what we will be doing with the restoration of the Kissimee is reconnecting through a vital artery the top of the whole environmental system to Lake Okeechobee and all the way down to Florida Bay and the Florida Keys. So it's a vital artery for wildlife, for water, for nutrients, for the flow of natural resources through this system.
And then there is this concern. The Kissimee River's vast floodplain ecosystem was unique in all the world. Hindsight provided the harsh lessons learned from channelization. How then, and at what point in time, can it be determined if the restoration is succeeding or failing?
The success of the restoration project will be tracked by a comprehensive ecological evaluation program that will measure responses by an array of fish and wildlife components. The scientific community is closely following restoration of the Kissimee River. The project is viewed worldwide as a model for other prospective ecosystem restoration efforts.
How will the Kissimee look in 20 years? Will its rich canvas of birds and fish return? Will its wetlands nourish and protect new generations of wildlife? Will its natural attributes please the eyes of boaters and hikers? The answer lies somewhere between the knowledge and tools of science, the healing power of nature, and the willingness of men and women to work toward the vision of a restored river.
Well, my dream of the river in 20 years would be that people would have access to it, that it would be in a stable condition. Sports would have the ability to go there and fish, if you would, but I'd also like to have the ability to ranch and farm.
I'd like to come back in 20 years with my grandchildren and stay at a lodge on the Kissimmee Prairie and maybe take a canoe trip down the restored river from the lake, Lake Kissimmee into Lake Okeechobee.
My dream of the Kissimmee River is for it to be restored to the way it used to be so the generations of the future can enjoy it.
Well, my dream for the Kissimmee is a project that doesn't really look like a project.
Kissimmee floodplain was the most beautiful place that I'd ever seen in my life when I was a kid over there, 16 years old. And I want to see it back like that again. hopefully within my lifetime, if not for my children and my children's children.
There have always been dreams for the Kissimmee. Dreams of opportunity, dreams of hope, nightmares of loss. And now there is a new vision. A vision of returning the river to its natural environment. An environment that made it truly unique. Deep in the heart of Florida, the Kissimmee still beckons. We are finally answering her call.